Katherine Brodsky, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thanks for having me. Are we going to save America together? Is that the goal of the show?
Single-handedly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a dad, so I don't know if it will work out so well on my end, but I'll let you do it.
You can help me single-handedly save America.
We'll see.
Well, actually, in some ways, you are, because you had reached out. I can't even remember if it was on Substack or email or what, but you basically reached out calling me out for not having enough differing voices on our channel. And I thought that was an interesting challenge. And then I noticed your book, No Apologies, which in some ways is interesting because many of the stories in this book are of people who have come to be guests on Dad Saves America and a bunch of other places. And even some I'd call genuine friends like Peter Boghossian and Brett Weinstein and Alex, who works with Michael Schellenberger. So I guess why don't we start off with why it's so hard?
Why did I call you out?
Yeah, actually, that's a good place to start. It's a little self-indulgent, but yeah, why bother to call me out? Who the hell am I? Why do you care?
I mean, I think I just got an email and I was reacting a little bit out of. I think the email said something like, you can't guess which political leanings we are. And I said, yes, I can. And one thing that I hear often is that more liberal leaning guests won't go on conservative shows, which I think is true.
Yeah.
But I've also noticed a trend of like the only reason that somebody more liberal gets invited on these more conservative shows is often because they agree or they want to like have a big kind of scandalous, destroy the libs kind of thing going on. And so, because it's been a frustrating thing for me to see how on the left side as well, right? You're not going to see a lot of conservative-minded people on those shows. And so it's been a criticism of mine. And then I felt like that was happening on the right as well. And I guess, as they would say, I was a little bit triggered. You were probably not the best recipient of my triggered effect. But that said, you then invited me to come on the show. And I couldn't say no after what I've just said. So I was in an interesting position, right?
Well, it's funny because, I have gone not through an evolution. Well, I have gone through different evolutions personally. I'm always doing that. But I've always been somebody that you'd say is probably right of center. I was like a little young Republican growing up. So I didn't go through I was a liberal and then my eyes got open. No, I've never voted for a Democrat my entire life. But I worked in entertainment and had a decade plus of being like someone who just kept his mouth shut among people who I really like otherwise loved and respected in Manhattan. And so I know that's a story that's probably something that we actually have in common. And and that taught me things, one of which was that sucks.
Yes.
That is not my favorite thing, to be in an environment where you feel like you can't actually have a proper discourse.
Yeah, and that's something that is really why I've started speaking out as a completely non-political person, I would say. I mean, I would self-identified as a liberal, but it's not something I thought about very much. I think it was just like, well, I believe people should have a lot of personal freedoms, and I like certain more socialist things. Some things I was a little bit more conservative on. I'm definitely in favor of capitalism, but it's not something like I thought about very often. And I think it only became because everything is so polarized right now. And there is so much attention paid to where somebody falls politically, that I would never meet somebody in the past and think, oh, is this person a conservative or a liberal or a leftist or whatever? There's a difference between liberals and leftists, by the way. But it's For like, sure. It's one of those things that I never thought about. And now I feel like everyone is overly focused on it instead of like listening to the argument. And I also grew up in a pretty liberal environment, especially working in the entertainment industry. And when I've encountered conservatives, honestly, I did so with just curiosity. I was just genuinely curious because I wasn't so,
Whoa, what kind of creature are you? Let me observe.
I know that totally sounded like that. In a way, it was because it's just
Yeah.
when you're not around people, and it was who think that way. You just don't know, and it wasn't like I was judging someone for thinking that way. It was just more like, okay, I'm curious where you're coming from. I was meeting people from sort of the South, and they talk different too. So there's a lot of going on there. And as I'm saying this, I realize how that sounds, and it wasn't that I wasn't exposed though to conservative thoughts, because I have read some of the thinkers, and I was definitely aware of Thomas Sewell and all these kinds of people. And you'd have the Ben Shapiro's pop up in the YouTube. So I was aware of them. It wasn't like I wasn't listening to anything else, but definitely more limited in terms of my exposure in my everyday life.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. So you had an experience, a firsthand experience with sort of getting bombarded by this sort of tribal stuff in a liberal echo chamber. Why don't you just share that story? Because I've gotten bits and pieces of it, but I haven't actually heard the whole thing explained.
Yeah, and I will just preface this with saying that this is not kind of where my change has happened, or my discovery of what was going on has happened. I was seeing we were living in an environment that I was noticing where people were really afraid to talk to each other, where if somebody said slightly the wrong thing, they would get harassed and mobbed, and especially in certain communities. So what happened to me was I was running a group for women journalists and women in the media it was just a job group, and it was an offshoot of a bigger group. But my group had about 30,000 members.
Wow, it's a big group.
Yeah, it was a big group.
And
it was
what year was this?
This is in 2020. I mean, the group started a little before that, but the situation, you think 2020 or 2021, but so kind of at the height of, you know what?
Yes.
The mobbing. And so the social hysteria, I guess, would be a good way to call it. And so I was running this group. We had a mentorship program. It was mentioned in the New York Times. People were getting jobs. It was no friction. I mean, because it's just jobs, right? And at one point, somebody posted a job opening at Fox News. And the person who posted it, she was really apologetic too. She was like, we're trying to make a change, have more diversity, all the buzzwords. And people just piled on to her, calling her fascist and all these kinds of things. And I saw my role as a moderator of the group, or the owner of the group, was to, step in. And so I wrote a post, saying, hey, let's stay away from personal attacks and also from politics. And we've come apart so much. Let's just come together and focus on jobs, basically.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very innocent post. But people didn't think that. And so they...
Don't you understand? It's basically like joining the Nazis.
Yeah, this is the funny part, is I clearly was a little bit oblivious to that part of it, because when I wrote that post, I didn't think, I didn't think anything would happen. But when I tell the story, you could tell by people's reactions, they know what's coming. So yes, I was called, I'd soon support the KKK. I was a white supremacist. White supremacists don't like me very much, just a hint there. But, but it's, it was just one of those things. It was just this crazy pile-on. People tried to, they would downvote my content. They would reach out to editors I worked with in the past to make sure that I never work again. I got
from your jobs
pictures
group that you
from my
curated.
jobs group. That's right.
Like, I got a job. Right. Katherine helped me get a job, but I want to make sure she can never work again.
It's funny. I didn't notice it that way before. Yeah. And I would get emoji. I would get pictures and threats from people, with mobs with tiki torches, and they would say, "We have long memories." I mean, things like that. It was just so ridiculous. And I'm actually kind of a people-pleasing person. That may not show now, but that's where I started. That's my default. So I like the idea of this like extreme confrontation and people telling me how awful I am. Like, I certainly thought about it. I considered it. I'm like, am I doing something so horrible? And the turning around point for me was, well, there's two things. One is, the biggest one would be if I disagreed with myself to that extent, how would I behave? What would I do? What would I say? And the behavior of these people was not something I would ever respect. And that was my big turning around point. And I'm happy to listen to people who responded, in good faith and really put forward good arguments and things like that. But those people that came with me with the tiki torches, I don't respect. And so why should I care what they have to say? And so that was like a big turning around point for me. And then the other thing that was happening is that in all these messages, I was also getting a lot of messages of support, but they were like terrified people. And they would say, what is happening to you? I see that it is wrong, but I am so ashamed. I'm so afraid to speak to defend you. And that was the other thing that was happening. And then also people were sharing their own stories of what was happening to them, where they've lost their entire careers, their friendship groups, social circles, all of that was happening. And a lot of those stories you will never hear. Like there's a lot more of these stories that you see in my book, but the ones that I talked about, for the most part, that they had some public attention, a lot of people just disappeared, and that's it.
What were you doing at the time? Like, where were you freelance? Where were you working? Expand on sort of what the industry was, because there's a lot of sectors of entertainment and journalism and the media. What were you actually focused on, and like what was the thrust of this group, this 30,000 people?
Yeah, I mean, I was a pretty successful freelance writer at the time. I had prior to that had written for The Guardian and The Washington Post and Variety for many years, Wired, Newsweek, like a lot of different publications. And so I was kind of at, I would say, a height of my career. I also worked in the film industry, field producing and doing things like that.
Oh, what kind of projects?
I'm going to get canceled. No. Well, I worked on things like Jack Ryan, for example, Men in the High Castle,
sweet.
A couple of those. So some good projects.
Yeah,
I enjoyed.
Those are great projects. Really, complex projects to be in the field producing.
Complex. Well, I didn't produce the actual films. I produced the content that promotes them, basically.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, then actually, we really came from very similar parts of the business, because I was at Spike and Nickelodeon and MTV on the promo side of things. So I was
that's
running the crew running the baby wannabe crew alongside the real big real crew.
That's literally what I did too. So, and so it's something that I really enjoy, actually. I've always loved cinema. I started out as a film critic, actually, but I created my own online magazine back when it was, still possible. And it was kind of the .com time. I think, did the bubble burst yet or not? I don't remember, but but it was something I really enjoyed. And was passionate about. And then I went from film review work to doing more interviews. So a lot of the writing, the journalism that I was doing was mostly entertainment journalism, a little bit of travel, a little bit of business and tech. Never wrote anything about politics, never injected an opinion into any of my writing either. So this was a big change.
It is. It's funny because when it is amazing the cultural shifts that have taken place in the past, let's say 25 years, because I got out of school 99, started working in New York and at Viacom. And if you watch like movies, like I recently saw, what was it? It was like this, the adaptation of the Scarlet Letter with Emma Stone. It was like, I forget the name of it, but it was.
I know which one you're talking about.
But that movie feels like it was made a million years. It's like a random, like tween rom-com, and it feels like it is from a completely different country almost compared to now. And it was 2010. I'm like, when was this movie? 2002? It's like, that doesn't make sense because Emma Stone would have been like a child.
No. Yeah, I think it's a little bit more recent than that. I really like that. That was the movie that made her, because she's so charismatic in it. And I thought it was a fun movie. Yeah, it was like, a pretty good movie.
It is funny the way, as much as like the entertainment industry was always very, very just like partisan Democrat politically, it wasn't like the politics always infused every second of everything that was made. Like you could watch a movie in 2008 and it could just be like a normal movie with the hero's journey in it.
You know what it is, though? It isn't even so much that, ideology wasn't part of the storytelling. It was, or, somebody wanted to teach some sort of lesson or present a certain point of view. It's just that it was in the subtext.
Yes.
So it wasn't pushing the audience over the head. And I think that's what people disconnect from today. It's not so much that you want to tell people to have empathy or like, let's respect people of different backgrounds or whatever, right? Like those are not terrible messages. It's just that they're so over the top and they don't really respect the audience either. And they also don't allow the audience the process of discovery. So when subtext, when it's well written, it's like you come to it yourself because you see what the story is, you feel for the characters, you think through, oh, well, how would I have felt in this situation? It's a very powerful, wonderful tool. But then if somebody goes and tells you, you should feel sad now, you should feel bad for this person now, like that's just bad storytelling. And I think that's what audiences are not connecting with. And I'm sure there's still some good movies out there. It's just that there is fewer. And then you have the system of this very corporate system that decides everything. There's no play in the same way that there used to be. And of course, all the remakes because it's safe and they know that it's going to make money or, adaptations and things like that because there's built-in audiences. It's just, it's not the wild, wild west anymore. I mean, Miramax, Weinstein, not great person, but definitely made a bunch of good movies. But part of that is because artists can come and sort of play. And I'm sure he was pretty like controlling. But I think he must have also given them a lot of room to play. And that's what artists need is to play. And sometimes they're going to make mistakes and they're going to say inappropriate things, and sometimes that inappropriate thing is the classic thing. I mean, the what's the movie with Robert Downey Jr. Thunder?
Tropic Thunder. Tropic Thunder.
Yeah. I mean,
Tropic
everyone's
Thunder, like it was made, and we all laughed, and then it went through the period of time where that was obviously a hate crime, I guess, that movie got made. But I think maybe now we can watch it again. I think it's okay.
I hope so. I mean, and the thing about that is like the humor wasn't punching down at anyone. It's making fun of stereotypes and things like that. But like the fact that that was like controversial later on is silly. Yeah.
Well, you maybe we'll come back to just like modern media criticism now that I know you've got that background because we're in interesting times on that front. Mm-hmm. But so you have this group of 30,000. That's a lot of people, especially considering that part of the business, it's not like an enormous business. It's hard to get in. As you climb up the ladder, you see there's not that many seats in these pyramids, and it's only shrunk over time in a lot of ways. So that's a pretty scary spot to be. If you've got 30,000 people in seeking or currently having jobs in media, journalism, and entertainment, and you're suddenly persona non grata, that's like your whole industry, our whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, because when I've decided to speak out about this, so initially what I did is I wrote an op-ed for Newsweek. That was my first op-ed that I've ever written. And I was fortunate enough that, I worked with a good editor and he accepted it. And I was so terrified of that, right? Because I was already getting so much attention. Now I'm going to get more attention. Mm-hmm. And, I didn't expect it to be positive attention. My family was like, don't do it because you're going to destroy your life. They were worried for me. I genuinely thought that was a very good chance of that happening. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do? Like open a coffee shop? Like, what am I going to do with my life? Now I realize, by the way, coffee shops are so difficult to run. So this was a stupid dream in the first place. But that was what I expected to happen. And I decided that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't speak up, because what was happening was wrong. And specifically, it wasn't just if it was just me, it wouldn't have mattered that much. I probably wouldn't have done it. It's because I was getting all these messages from people to whom this has been happening. I realized what a huge phenomenon that is. And I felt like there needed to be kind of a reasonable, rational, I hope, voice to speak about that. And so I did. And so I wrote this article, and actually, it was interesting. They didn't come after me very much anyways after that. It was like, it was enough of a push. And then a lot of people discovered me through that article who may have gone through something like that, or were people who were speaking out about these issues and this kind of intolerance in the culture towards just diverse opinions and dissent. Yeah.
Your parents have some experience with this, as I understand it.
Yes.
So share a little bit more about your family background, because it's very instructive here. And I'm just curious to understand sort of how it informed the way you saw what was happening, what kind of conversations you were having with your folks.
Yeah, so I was born in the Soviet Union, in the part that is currently Ukraine, and hopefully stays that way. My family, so my parents are, from that background. And I was young when we left, so I wasn't as affected by it, but my parents were. In fact, one of their key reasons for leaving was because they wanted me to have an actual future. For them, they were recognizing a lot of the patterns of what we were seeing culturally in terms of how speech was being silenced. In the Soviet Union, everyone's equal, but some animals are more equal than others, as they say.
Right.
And it's like, well, you can say anything you want, except you can't say, as long as it's the approved narrative, right? And in there, you had the threat both from the government and individuals. So, people did disappear in black cars in the middle of the night, never to be heard from again for their speech. There had to be a lot of subversion to say certain things that people wanted to say. Artists had to be extra creative. And in terms of, individuals, you never knew who you could trust, because you say the wrong thing to somebody who's the wrong person, and that's it, you're ruined. And it was this really tense environment that they grew up in. And they were also very brainwashed. They had to take atheism classes, communism classes, like all these things were actually taught. And enforced, essentially, both socially and governmentally. And my parents, when they were seeing some of these trends in North America, honestly, I dismissed it, the old folks.
No. Dig into that. So what were your parents saying, and how did you feel when you heard it? Like, what? Put us in that moment of your parents being like, "This is looking a little too much like 1960s Ukraine."
Yeah. It was constant. For them, it was, the kinds of words that you had to use, the sort of political correctness, but also everyone had to speak a sort of the same language. In schools, you're sort of taught things a certain way, and challenging that could get you in trouble. Now, I was always a little bit of I will say, I even though I'm a people pleaser, I'm also contrarian. So I'm not that great with authority.
Interesting combo.
Yeah. I mean, I'm polite. I'm not going to like be an ass for the sake of it. But if I sort of disagree or see little chinks in arguments, like, I always had a very independent mind. And I also think that came from my parents. I think because they were so distrustful of the system. And while I was probably more trustful, I think their nagging way of thinking, I inherited that in some ways. I was always like looking for the contrarian view in something. But, it doesn't mean I always disagree with things. I don't believe in being contrarian for the sake of it. But I wasn't just taking things at surface level. I am a little bit allergic to crowd kind of displays of emotion, or like saying catchphrases, things like that. Is just that never kind of sat with me, I guess. And with my parents, because they were always so judgy of like the narratives and how things were framed in news and what politicians said, I think there is like, a feeling of like, oh, they're just overreacting. And I think also a feeling of like, this can't happen here. So this is just their fears from the Soviet Union. Yes, there might be some similarities, but this could never happen here. This is an open, free society, capitalist socialist, I guess, which seems like contradictory things.
Well, yeah,
but
it's a mixed economy with a fairly large government, but not. We have private markets, we have private property, so we're
and so it didn't. And what I've later realized, and also looking at history, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of people to think a certain way, and it doesn't take a lot of people to have a revolution and to change things.
Yeah.
All it takes is very radical individuals, and we see that in a lot of different historical events. It's everyone else being afraid to actually speak up when they see something that doesn't quite sit right with them. And I think a lot of times people see something, they have a sense that maybe this is not quite right, but they're not maybe sure, and they want to be nice. And this is where, there are certain things that we could say in the past and nobody would call you a racist for it because it's not coming from a place that's racist. But now it's like, well, if you say that, you're not allowed. So it's something like, as an example of that, I very harshly judge cultures that don't give equal rights to, say, women, and stone women and make them wear head coverings. That doesn't mean I dislike everyone from that culture or that I hate everyone, but it's just that. But that is a valid criticism, and everyone should, frankly, share that criticism.
Well, there used to be this time, right? There was a time where it was a sign of utter barbarism if a community mutilated the genitals of their children. That used to be generally considered to be sort of the most horrific act of barbaric behavior you could imagine. and now we call it gender affirming care.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are different things too, right? Because I don't want to
throwing a little bit of a bomb
two.
there, but
You are. I think that's one of those issues that's incredibly nuanced and difficult. And I think what has happened is that with gender affirming care is that because the discourse was sort of left to radicals, it made the discourse really poisoned. So what I was seeing in the beginning of that particular issue is that, there were like radical activists from the trans world, and they were shutting down speech, right? You were a bigot, you were transphobic. If you say anything, if you question anything, you're a TERF. And then I thought that there were people with legitimate concerns about children or certain spaces, like in sports, prisons. I think those are legitimate topics for conversation. But then I started seeing like just utter hate and bigotry, like legitimate one, and just awful things masquerading behind this concern for just behind these like what appear to be legitimate concerns. And I think now the discourse is just so poisoned, because I can understand why somebody might advocate for even children transitioning. I also understand why somebody is really deeply concerned about that, because that child might not be actually trans. There might be other things going on, or, the affirmative care system. And then they end up, with an irreversible decision on their hands, right? That is legitimate concern. And I also see the other side of it, which is, well, look, if you don't, you're living with this extreme dysmorphia, and you are basically, dysmorphia. I always confuse the two, dysmorphia and dysphoria.
They might be I don't want to misspeak and say they're interchangeable, but
no, I don't think they are. But I always end up.
They're related. They're related.
Yeah.
Gender dysphoria is the generally used term for this. This belief.
Sure. Well, but this is a belief that they have. This is how they experience the world. You can disagree with aspects of it, but you can't disagree with the fact that somebody feels that. So they do. So that's their experience. And, if they transition early, then they have a better transition, right? They fit in better, so they might have a better outcome. That's the argument.
That's the argument.
That's the argument. Yeah.
I totally reject it, but I'm perfectly happy to talk about it. I've had people on the show about it. It's probably the most incendiary topic I've touched on here at this table, because it's so difficult. And I have a fairly intolerant perspective on it. I think if you do anything to kids, they don't have agency. We don't let them get tattoos. I think it's monstrous. I think think the way that's looked at from that perspective, tattoos are this like superficial physical decoration, right? And versus this, the argument would be that it's like, well, they would say healthcare, and so we do things to children if they. Anyways, this is a whole big topic. We don't have to go off on a super.
We don't have to go all the way there. But,
it's a good example of the kind of thing that you were seeing, though, right? It's a kind of important conversation, especially important for the adults to have, given that it's about what we do with our kids.
Yeah.
And everything went off the rails with this thing. It just went off the rails.
Well, we can't have a legitimate conversation about it. Very few people can, because we're afraid of saying what we really think, or people are just incredibly radicalized on both ends of this issue. So it doesn't leave a lot of common ground or representation of more moderate voices on this topic and other topics. So this is where that example is. Like, we probably do disagree to an extent. I think there's levels of agreement as well on this particular topic. However, you don't see a lot of conversations about that modeled that way. And part of that is also the media ecosystem, which, outrage thrives. If you post something, about a bigoted, person, or you post something about, a crime that a trans person committed, that goes viral.
Mm-hmm.
And so within that landscape, it's really difficult to have discourse that's actually like, hey, let's sit down and figure this out. And I like generally sit down with people and I like, hey, I might be wrong. I think I sometimes
Right.
am a little too open-minded, because I can see arguments on both sides really strongly on a lot of topics. And ultimately, where I end up landing, I'm either unsure, and I think it should be okay to admit that you're unsure about something. And it's not, right? It's not a news, headline grabbing thing. Oh, you know what? I'm not sure. I haven't made up my mind yet. Which a lot of things we shouldn't be making up our minds about because we don't have the information. Or, look, I do have a certain worldview. You have a certain worldview. And also emotion. And all of these things do play a role in how we react to certain ideas. And we may logically argue, and each of our arguments might be sound logically. But at the end of the day, we're going to come up to where our values are,
Mm-hmm.
where our beliefs are, where our emotions are.
Yeah, it's David Hume said basically that our reason is always a slave to our passions, and rightly so. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the Jonathan Haidt has talked about this with his notion of the elephant and the rider, that we have this rational capacity to frame the decisions we make and then to justify them. But at the end of the day, it is our sort of gut intuition that drives the decision point. The moment where we say, I'm comfortable with this, or I'm not comfortable with it. And then sort of like a PR firm up in our head, we then construct the rational argument to justify the decision that was at a minimum, at least substantially intuitive/emotional gut.
100%. And our gut isn't necessarily, our gut is this like mysterious thing, but it is a certain calculation of our experiences, of things that our mind has absorbed. And it's just it's not something we should always follow, because I very much believe in rationality and getting all the facts. But it does tell us something in certain situations, so I wouldn't discount our gut at all. But it is, for me, like sometimes my brain doesn't align with my feelings either. I might have a reaction to something that's an emotional reaction, or it comes from values and emotion. And then when I think about it in a more logical way, then, it's and take the emotion out, I might come to a different conclusion. And then it's like, okay, how do you work with the two? Because the emotional reaction remains, regardless of what your logical mind has come to. How do you live with the two if they're diametrically opposed?
It's getting harder. It's getting harder to do that, especially when what we experience through our screens is this weird reinforcement engine, and it can just get you riled, and then you start, you watch something about whatever the topic is that piques your interest, and next thing you know, you've watched 14 different videos about Pakistani rape gangs in the UK, for example, and it's like, that sure seems to be a real problem. That seems heinous. But at the same time, I'm an American. I don't really know the full scope of what's going on. Any opinion I'm going to have on the matter is basically being formed on the basis of a pretty thin and maybe even just repetitious bunch of information that YouTube fed me in my feed. So how do I, as an adult, grapple with that? What should I even care about it? It's a weird thing, this world we live in now. How do
It's a
you?
reality delusion, essentially, right? You're basically, you don't know what the reality is, because how do you piece together reality? It's it's what you observe yourself, what you see with your own eyes and experience. It's what people tell you, and it's what the media shows you, and the media, including social media. And so if certain things are shown at a disproportionate rate, do they reflect reality? Often not, right? Because sensationalist things are much more likely. And it's hard not to be, to some extent, programmed by that. If that's repeated to you over and over, our brain ends up, I mean, this is why lies work so well in social media. If you hear something for the first time, your brain goes, oh, this is new information. So it's more analytical. So it analyzes and pays attention to it. But the more something is repeated, it is basically then it gets um, your your brain's like guards are bypassed, and you start believing in it. And there's a lot of examples of things that people believe that just because of they have been repeated and not because they're true. You can verifiably test. And it's frustrating to me too, because what I'm seeing is a lot of people think that things are relative and there is no truth. We live in a post-truth world, and that's not true. We can have different opinions about things, but there are factual, information that we can verify. And yet we live in a world where these things are spread so widely, so quickly. And this is where people are getting most of their information. And then you got the algorithms. So, my my algorithm is probably, it's actually, I was going to say it's probably different from yours, but I'm not sure that it is, but it is different from many people's. And it's, I can't do anything about it. Like if I go on, I do use TikTok sometimes to look at the videos, or YouTube, and my experience there is really radically different than it is on X or Twitter. It's like on X, Twitter, I only have very specific content that I see. On TikTok, I never see anything political. I know other people do see incredibly political things. So we all live in these different timelines as
Yeah.
well of information. So how the heck are we supposed to know what is really going on in the world, what's really happening? And again, it's like, if I'm seeing videos of these gangs doing terrible things repeatedly, I am going to think, or going to have the impression, that the UK is a dangerous place and this is what's going on. But that's selected for me. And then the only way for me to really understand what's going on is probably to look at statistics and studies and other information, and maybe talk to a wider group of people who maybe live in different regions, because also it's all very regional. Even New York, I lived in New York for years, and I found it quite safe. I would walk home at 3 o'clock in the morning from a class at Carnegie Hall, and it was
It was
I
the
think it was
safest big city in the country. I think it
it
might. I
was
think it might still be, actually.
well, and but you constantly hear stories, people being pushed in subways, and it's
Yeah.
dangerous, and this gets repeated. And then I talk to my friends who live in New York. I'm like, is this actually true? And they're like, no. Now, we tend to notice changes a little bit less when we live in those environments,
Hmm.
but nonetheless, it's still not what is being shown, because people choose to, only show you a little part of that, of the full image, and you mistake that little part of the image for the whole picture. And that's a big problem that we have.
So, as you went through these different stories of people who had points of view, I think most of the stories are people who would be sort of in what you would call liberal circles, academics, journalists, authors, writers, who get attacked by the mob for saying something eminently reasonable. What did you learn from spending that time? And like, is there a story? Is any of the people in that you sort of catalog that sort of continue to stand out in your mind as being instructive, or being something that it really took you aback?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out to me as a pattern is in how these people responded, right? Why these people are in the book is because ultimately they did stand up and push back. The people who didn't are not in the book because they're not willing to put their names out there and they're still kind of live in fear. But what it is that made them stand up to, I call them bullies because it's essentially what they are.
Often
It's
cry
that
bullies too, by the way.
Oh yes, I kind of like that term,
Yeah,
pridefully.
yeah, me
I
too.
can
It's
certainly think of one person I think that's where it came from. But yeah, I think those people stood up to that because they knew it was wrong. It wasn't, they didn't feel like they could operate in any other way. And I think that was a big takeaway from that. And some of those people lost a lot. I think it's important to understand that there is a loss that comes with that.
yeah.
I don't think they always thought through what the consequences would be. I think it was just like, well, this is happening. This is unfair. Of course, I have to speak up. Or if I can't speak up for a friend of mine, who am I? And I've heard a lot of those kinds of things as well. So it's people not being able to operate otherwise. But I remember even when it was happening to me, I was like, well, I can't blame those who don't stand up. They have a lot to lose. They have families and livelihoods. I still think it's a personal choice, but at the same time, I do think I judge that a bit more now because ultimately it's in the silence and it's in the complicity that these bad things happen and they get worse. And they're only going to get worse if there's no pushback. Now, we've seen tremendous pushback, mostly from the conservative
Mhm.
side of things.
Yep.
And I think the pendulum is swinging too much the other way. That's my view.
That's something for us to
It's
talk about more. But yeah, keep
yeah,
going.
okay, sure. But at the same time, that is a reaction to this very extreme that was happening. So people are going to respond that way. And I also feel like it was the responsibility really of people more on that political side to stand up and push back and not be like put in with the radicals on their end. And that responsibility in large was abdicated, which is why I think we're seeing what we're seeing. And there were like, in terms of the people who were targeted, I think a lot of that would happen in liberal circles to liberals. And
Hmm.
I think the reason is like, it's like you're not in line, towing the line of your tribe, right? The punishment is more severe. If you ostracize somebody who's a conservative and they're they have other conservative friends and they're not necessarily going to be affected by it. Now they were in like
And we know they're a
academia, for
Nazi,
example,
so it's
and then we know
justified.
they're no. But I think, well, with conservatives, when I looked at it, like a lot of it was in academia.
Hmm.
I think with conservatives, a lot of it was them hiding that they were conservatives. And if they exist within the conservative ecosystem, then they're not really good targets, right? But if they are existing within a liberal ecosystem, then that's different. And of course, you had speakers that were turned away, or you had, professors that were targeted for being conservative. So you definitely had a lot of targeting of conservatives as well. But a lot of people, I think, hit it if they were within the liberal environments.
Well, and there's been a clear feedback loop, and people like Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy have focused on this empirically, that the sort of conservative to liberal ratios in academia have gone into like a terminal feedback loop where the humanities will often have just zero
Yeah.
Republicans. Where at least when I went to college in the 90s, there were some, especially in like economics or engineering
Yeah.
or, stuff that involved reality. You'd have people who weren't on the far left. And even the people that teachers I had in things like philosophy who were kind of like left wingers, it was not the same. I like to think of the 90s right now. My model of the 90s is that it was the peak of Western civilization, and I'm waiting to be proven wrong on that. There was enough of a balance that these institutions, even if they were in the process of like rotting, they still had like new growth. The fall would come around and there'd be some green leaves on the tree. They weren't all brown and dead on the inside. It seems like a lot of them are dead.
My acting teacher was actually a Republican, which was interesting. You wouldn't expect it. He was somebody who was actually going to become a priest. The reason I said it, I'm not sure if that's the right word for what it was, but he was going to go into ministry, and then he ended up in acting, and he, taught some really famous people and built World Trade Center with his hands, just because he really wanted to work with his hands. And then there'd be like these famous actors who would show up. His name is Robert X. Modica. He was a very interesting, wonderful person. And our class was mixed of different people. And I think it's really essential to have different perspectives because, including in art, certainly the left has been more drawn, I think, also towards culture and art. So I think it just tends to be that way.
Yeah.
And then I think there is like a level of like rejection if you are not on the left in these ecosystems. But, you've got, I think David Mamet is now a conservative. I don't think he was in the past, but he is now. And art is really a conversation. And if it's a one-sided conversation, it's not very interesting. And I think what art is also good at is if you're, for example, an actor or you're studying theater or you're writing, it's a great tool for empathy and understanding people's perspectives. Because if you are reading, you get a role and it's like maybe a person you don't like very much, you can't play them as if you don't like them. You have to understand what they think.
Right. Yeah.
Most people are not just like these evil entities. You might think that the actions that they take are really bad actions. And it is true. Some of them are, at least subjectively. But they think they're right? And I think it's important to understand why they think they're right, even if you disagree with them. And so I think art can really foster that understanding. And if you're only seeing this like one perspective in it, then you don't build that understanding. So, I think a lot of times theater world acting gets like a bad reputation, but for those who take it seriously and do it the right way, I think it's a great, I think it's a really great tool for developing these understandings and greater tolerance as well, because you do, we might disagree on something, I don't know, whatever, abortion or something, but you can either choose to vilify. So somebody who's not pro-choice, somebody who's pro-life, you could say, well, that person just wants to control my body and doesn't want me to have choices, blah, 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 right? Or you can be like, okay, the reason that somebody thinks that is because they think they're protecting another entity, another body. Now, you might disagree with them, but you can see that their intention is a positive intention. They're not coming from some place of hate or control. I think that's incredibly important. Again, you may still disagree and you may have fights about the policies, but at least you're speaking the same language and you're not vilifying or dehumanizing people.
I think, having spent most of my adult life in the arts in one way or another, I think there's something very ingrained, right? That the kind of mindset, the sort of trait openness, there's a certain sense in which I do think great actors are often a kind of skilled empty vessel, right? You're sort of, especially people that can sort of flex into such radically different roles and sort of lose themselves in it. It's not a surprise that these would be people that tend to be politically left. It's just like it's almost genetic, I think, in that sense. I don't think it's like a conspiracy that arts and letters, media and entertainment have tended to be places dominated by left of center people.
It's definitely dominated by that, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily empty. Like the great actors, I wouldn't say are empty vessels, because I think as an actor, you're writing all the lines in between. And a good actor is somebody who can write a really good script, essentially. So you can't be an empty vessel and write a really good script. You can like project certain things. Yes, you can. There's certainly a lot of successful actors who are empty vessels in that way. But really, really great actors, I think, are those who write really great monologue, essentially.
Yeah, I guess what I mean by that is, I mean, to some extent, there's some people who literally are like an empty vessel and they don't have a lot going on.
Sure, there's some.
There's plenty. Probably most. But I think the great ones, I would agree. I think what I mean by that isn't a flippant criticism, is you have to be able to lose yourself the way you're saying, and that takes a kind of like that is a particular kind of skill, and I think lawyers can have this and also can, to some extent, suffer from its impacts, which is if you're a defense attorney and you are obliged to fight right up to the edge of what's admissible on behalf of your client and kind of push the edge. That's what great lawyers end up doing. They push right up against the edge of what's an admissible argument, and all along the way, that's the nature of our system. It takes a toll on your mind if you're having to make arguments in favor of someone who you truly believe is guilty, and you're defending them anyway because that's your job. And you have to exist in this tension between, I am part of a system that in order for it to work and deliver justice, I have to make arguments for someone who I think is wrong. And I have to get...
They value that over the individual case, essentially. Yeah, they value the ideal over the individual.
And I think that's a very difficult place to occupy. And I think it is necessary, and yet it has this downside, which in the case of a lot of lawyers is like you end up in a place that's sort of like nihilistic, where like there is no truth anymore. And I've been fighting for people, like your compass gets lost. And I think that's
maybe
that's a risk for people who spend a lot of time inhabiting other people in a certain sense.
I would actually say within the acting world or the film art world, it's more to do with, because there used to be more conservatives, right? It used to be a little bit more dominated by those kinds of people. And I think it's just a cultural change where I think people tend to go where they see more of a reflection of themselves. And at a certain point that changed. And so I think it's very difficult for conservatives to really see themselves fitting into that world. And so less conservatives end up going in there. And it's more hostile now towards conservatives because of the political climate. So also another reason why. So I don't think it's necessarily that conservatives are like completely not, have a different everything temperament. Don't have taste. Yeah, I mean, I am a fan of David Mamet. He's an amazing writer. So definitely there's taste, and Clint Eastwood, and there's been lots of people. But I love my teacher was amazing. But it's like I think it is something where I think the environment does dictate a lot as whether, because I could see the conservative attempts to now create their own counterculture. And I mean, maybe they're not as good because it hasn't been, I think conservatives are doing really well with like the podcasting world and those kinds of things. I think maybe comedy to some extent, certain individuals. The content world not as developed at this point. It might change, right? I don't know, but it's not there. And there is probably a temperament. If you're more artistic, maybe you do tend to lean a little bit more left. I'm not entirely sure. This is one of those things where I'm going to say I'm not entirely sure.
It's fair. I mean, a lot of it for me, I mean, some of it I like look towards the, I can sort of copy and paste Jordan Peterson's opinions on this kind of stuff from the big five sort of psychology. Some of it's just that I've always I wanted to be a Disney animator when I was a kid. So I was always an artist. And
Mhm.
I was also always a little bit of a right winger. So I just know what it felt like and how much of a in the minority I was throughout that entire
But you were
process.
still drawn towards art, right? Even though
Oh,
you
yeah.
were a conservative.
Yeah.
So what is it about you that was drawn to art?
I just like it. I like it. I like beauty. I think I'm a big fan of craftsmanship too, for me.
Mhm.
So, and I think that's one thing about a less understood element of the business is even today, there's plenty of conservatives in entertainment. They're all below the line. They're all in grip and electric. They're all in the camera department.
Yes.
I know these guys. They're my friends. So there's plenty of great artists with beautiful eye, like a beautiful eye and a beautiful sense of what it means to create beauty that are, turning around and pulling the lever for Republicans or whatever. What opinion do you hold at the moment that is the most cancelable?
Thanks a lot for that question. I mean, I think my opinion on Israel is probably the most what would get me most targeted.
And that
So
is, what's your take?
not a genocide. I don't think Israel is doing everything perfectly well, and especially at this point, I'm really not sure. But I don't think there is an attempt to annihilate a whole population of people based on their ethnicity or in general. I think it's just a very brutal war. Do I know if every move is correct? No, I don't. There's no way for me to know. I'm not an expert in military. I don't know what's happening on the ground. And I think people think that they know more than they do.
Yeah, it's
But
very hard to know.
but in terms of like intent, certainly there are some people who've said, things like that with it, but that's not the behavior. So my strongest argument would be that that if there was that intent, they would have already been able to do it. Two, they would have been able to. There is no reason for them to send warnings, make phone calls, and do any of these things that seem to want to prevent casualties. If the intent was to actually annihilate people, and also, I just don't think that the people of Israel, except for some insane radicals, would be comfortable in any way with that. And there are radicals, of course. There are people who are just disgusting, but that is not what I believe. And so I guess that makes me a terrible person and cancelable, all that kind of stuff for sure.
Your family is Jewish descent. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And I had lived in Israel for 6 years. So part of my experience comes from I lived through the Gulf War. I lived through when there were constant bombings, side bombings and all that kind of stuff. So I understand what that is like. I also see what people within that society, I haven't lived there in a very long time, but I have visited. And people there don't talk, as if there were supremacists or any of these other crazy narratives that I hear constantly. I'm sure after October 7th, there was a lot of more hate because of what had happened. I know that I see some of the comments that some people make about leveling Gaza and things like that. Those people make it in this massive anger. But you have to look at, okay, some people are making, most people do not make such comments. And I think that the efforts, you can certainly be critical of some of them. I was critical, I think when they said no food or water, electricity, I thought that was wrong. Now I think that the intent of that wasn't to starve an entire population. I think their intent was to put pressure on Hamas at the time. But at the same time, I don't think you can use a population for that. That's where my line is. At the same time, yeah, I just don't think that's what's going on. There's so much absolutely false narratives that I hear. I think there's like valid criticism and that's factual, and there's a lot that is absolute BS.
I had Brett Weinstein on the show, and we talked about it quite a bit actually. We don't have to go down a deep rabbit hole here because I think neither of us are probably expert enough for it to be all that valuable. But you did live in the country. It's interesting. I haven't been to Israel. I have one friend in particular who's a dear friend, Russ Roberts. He's an economist, very thoughtful person. I really can think of him as extended family. He now runs Shalem College in Israel. And my window into that society, to the best of my ability, is it is exactly what you would expect if you've had exposure to a fair number of Jewish people, which is it has a radically wide range of beliefs because all people have wide ranges of beliefs and their genetic identity isn't determinative of their beliefs.
Yeah.
And especially the Jews. It's like you've got a very well-educated society.
An argumentative
that's
society.
Argumentative. Yeah. That's always haggling about everything. And they have a really wide range of opinions in general.
And also very multicultural in the sense that you have you go to, I was actually surprised because when I lived there as a kid, it was Sephardic Jews and it was like Ashkenazi Jews. And the Ashkenazi Jews were kind of at a lower on the totem pole because they were, newly immigrated and poor. Things have kind of shifted since then. But then you have so right now you have 60% of the countries of the Jews are Sephardic Jews. So that means they came from these countries in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Black people who are also Jewish. And, so you've got a very colorful group of people with very different backgrounds and cultures as well. Very different opinions. And you have a very, they also have a big bright left kind of, from what I understand. I haven't been, following their politics that particularly closely since I don't live there and I don't participate in that. I kind of let that just be theirs. But, when I lived there, it was as a child. So I had that experience. And then when I visited, I visited Arab towns also. And I think I just see how many things people are just massively misinformed about. When I see something that's just false, it's hard for me not to speak about it. And I think because I've spoken out more about that and the falsehoods that I would see in how people talked about it, either logical misunderstandings or just outright lies, it seems like I'm just have no criticism of Israel at all, but of course I do. It's just that there's so many people to fill those shoes right now and very few people on the other side. And I do think while I think there has been targeting of cancellations, certainly of some of the pro-Palestinian activists and things like that, certainly that's happening. I don't think anybody would be terribly worried carrying wearing keffiyeh and walking down the street or waving, a Palestinian flag versus an Israeli flag or wearing a Star of David. I just don't think it's the same in terms of the potential violence one might experience or just yelling or whatever. It's such a tricky topic because you don't want to be wrong on something so big, right? Where people's lives are at stake and people are dying and hurting and that weighs on me a lot, all I can do is I know where I'm coming from with this. I know that I, certainly not racist, certainly care about people's lives of, if they're Palestinian or not. And I try to look at facts. When people write something that doesn't feel like it's correct, I don't immediately go and push back on that. I go, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Let me look into it and check. So all the statements that I've made, I like literally researched everything and made sure that I was correct on it. And it doesn't mean I will never get anything wrong, but I try to do my best.
So it's interesting. You have a deep background at this point in actual professional writing for major publications going back long enough to the before Facebook times. And here we are in this moment. I noticed you had some tweets about sort of retweeting ways to navigate the world of images. These images come into our feeds, and a lot of times they're just fake. And AI now is making it so that you can create, like one example here I've got pulled up was an example of an image of Zelensky looking like a younger Zelensky at some kind of crazy pride event with a giant afro wig. And it's like, okay, this is false. But it's been retweeted by somebody who thinks it's true. Like, look at the creep that we're backing. This is all over the place. Earlier you sort of talked about where you feel like maybe the backlash to woke has gone too far. I definitely feel like this is maybe an area where that's happening.
Yes. Well, and just there's an over the top, like, there's a few things. Like, one is this enormous hate towards anything that's remotely left without really, in a way that's not grounded, right? Like, without trying to understand. Like, I see the same behavior that I saw on the left that I didn't like and spoke out against happening on the right. The cancellation attempts, things like that.
Do you have any examples that are?
Yeah, I mean, even like the Dylan Mulvaney thing, I mean, that was a bad advertising decision, right? But anytime there is something like that, there is a whole campaign, and it turns so enormously hateful. I've written about this before where I had like more examples. I mean, books. So, for example, there's a claim that the books that get banned from school libraries is because they're hypersexualized, and to some extent that is true. Some of those books I would agree, are inappropriate and probably do rightfully get banned. But amongst these books, I've seen things that are like ideologically just not aligned, like not Idris, the guy with the X in his middle name. I forgot his name. Yeah, him. Yeah. There's a book by him. I'm not a fan of this guy, but I think if you're
a low-grade half-wit.
No, but you should be able to read a low-grade half-wit, even just to see what a low-grade half-wit says. And I've read, like, when I was young, I read like all sorts of books and watched all sorts of movies, probably some inappropriate for my age, but hey, I turned out okay, right? And then there was like a science fiction book. So there weren't like things that were all blatantly like, okay, hypersexualized, which is like totally fair. I've seen some of those examples. Yeah, that doesn't seem appropriate for kids in high school or
like
middle school.
Genderqueer. I mean, specifically, that specific book is pretty heinous.
Okay. Does it have a lot of like? Well, I haven't.
It's like, here, let's do it. Let's have drawings about how to conduct oral sex.
Yeah, that's probably not.
Shouldn't be in the kids' library.
Probably not. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's legitimate grievances, and I think there's also like things that have gone way over the top. So things like that. When it comes to just discourse in general, I think there is the same, like, people will just get labeled a commie. I mean, I've been put on all sorts of lists that call me a Marxist or a commie. Like, don't really identify with that ideology at all. But it's just for
that's
saying
a little
something
rich coming from a former Soviet republic.
That's right. And I'm like, okay,
kind of missing the mark.
There is, yeah, and then just kind of like. I kind of lost my track of thought with my examples. I'll be
Well,
honest.
I think it's an interesting. So, to come back to the start of our conversation, you had kind of reached out with in a moment of feeling maybe triggered against right-wing reactionaries and decided
Yes.
I should be on the list of people to scold.
I actually didn't.
I'm just kidding. But
Yeah.
I think I grapple with these questions quite a bit, all the time, actually. This show, my intention with this show and all this activity I do on this channel is to try to navigate as a father, as a man. Like, what does it mean to be an adult? What does it mean to bring what I think is an adult perspective to the world? Often that's about how to think about our kids. Sometimes it's just about how to address the issues of the day, like as if, this is one of the things that's funny. Somebody said, like, what, you can't cover these political things. What's that got to do with being a dad? It's like, well, what do you think the conversations are when your kids come home and they talked about current events and social studies? It's how do I understand the world, especially when it comes to stuff like this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's like our kids are going off to college and they're getting bombarded, or they're just getting bombarded on TikTok and amongst themselves, and then having and then developing opinions. And it's like, well, how are you going to talk about that? And so that's one of the reasons, aside from just selfish personal interest, that I touch on a wide range of things. There's this interesting challenge, right? So there are times where something sounds hyperbolic and also happens to be correct. And there's times when it's hyperbole to make a point and it's playful and it's okay. And then there's times where you're actually just clouding the ability to understand what the truth is in the name of making a point and being emotional.
But you got things like Libs of TikTok, for example, right? And that account may sometimes highlight cases that should be highlighted, but it also will take into account, somebody just being really weird and look, this is leftism or whatever. And it's just cruel. And I think that is a form of bullying. No different from the ones, in fact, a completely unnecessary. This person isn't even being bullied on their thoughts. It's just their appearance, for example. I've noticed a lot of intolerance towards, okay, somebody has a piercing. I don't like like these big piercings. I don't like them, but I'm not going to like judge a person like entirely on their piercing. And I see that there's a lot of people who talk about repelling I don't remember which amendment it is, but for women to vote.
Yeah, it's the 19th.
19th. Okay. So the 19th Amendment. So
yeah.
Things like that. And then like that people should be, trans people should all be institutionalized and committed. I do think that comes from a very hateful place, as opposed to, okay, let's discuss like, okay, kids should be protected, right? Or certain spaces should be protected. That is what I've been seeing a lot of.
Sure.
Now, to be fair, I do also see some pushback within that community, the conservative. I don't know, like I hesitate to use the word conservative because it's like it's a lot of different groups, right? There is like a white supremacy movement for sure, which I didn't see before. So when people on the left were saying, "Oh, there's all these white supremacists," I was like, the conservatives that I encounter weren't white supremacists or racist. But then there is that group, and it's not a small group, but it's also hard to judge how big it is because what you see in social media, like probably not that representative of the overall population, but it's there. Now, I do see people pushing back on it, which I really respect. You've got, anti-immigration. Okay, well, there is the groups that are like, well, our borders are too loose. We need to have better enforcement. And that seems like a pretty, moderate perspective. And then you have groups that are like, we should not, this is a white country, white Christian country, and, we should actually re-immigrate. There is that movement too. So when I'm seeing within that, and there are groups that just kind of, that don't push back, and there are groups that do. And so I don't have an issue so much with the people who are pushing back on the extremists within them. I actually respect them for doing that. And I see a lot. I would even say I see more of that than I saw of people on the right, on the left pushing back.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of inner fighting.
Yeah. I think that there. I'm curious how you think about this. So, because I think that we're in a time. So, for one thing, it's so difficult. We see these people and even groups of people. Like when you really try to think about like how many people need to make a post or leave a comment on a tweet in order for it to feel like it's a significant number of people, right? You know, you post something about, say, being pro-Israel in some particular instance. How many quotes saying just like objectively like hateful anti-Semitic things need to happen for you to feel like, well, there's a real like Jew-hating white supremacy movement? It's not clear that that's data. I'm not saying it's not. I think there is. I think there's a real serious problem going on. I don't know the size of it. I don't think it's as big as the everyone always screaming fascism makes it out to be, but it is this interesting problem.
Know. I think you're right on the data, and I would love to have a more data-informed opinion on that, because what I did see is a massive increase. So based on my own experience, now I don't know if it's just the algorithm pushing more of it.
Eric Weinstein's talked about this too, and so is Brett.
Yeah. So I mean, anti-Semitic content was always there. And honestly, it was like, okay, there's some people who, like, I don't care that much, honestly. But it's like in my face all the time, to the point where when I first started talking about it, I was really gaslit by my own followers. They're like, we don't see anything like that. And they weren't. Now a lot of them have come to me and said, I'm sorry. I take that back. I just didn't see it before. And it was there. They thought I was over exaggerating what, misrepresenting or like, how everyone's like, oh, the tiniest microaggression is racism. But that's not what was going on. The things that people were sending me were like very blatant, very vile. It wasn't like a tiny thing. And it's tough because you see it on a daily basis and experience it on a daily basis like a lot. So I think it bothers me more than it used to, just because of the amount of it, because it feels like there's so much hate. But do I know how many people that represents in the real world? I don't. And that gives me some comfort, I think, too, because maybe it's just that it's all just because that content just gets pushed so heavily and gets promoted so heavily that I'm seeing so much of it, and maybe it doesn't represent. But when people say, it's not real life, it's also not quite true, right? Because outside of bots, you still have real people who have these views. Now, maybe they wouldn't express them to my face. They probably wouldn't. They'd be cowards or wouldn't want the stigma that comes with it or the pushback. They wouldn't express those maybe in the real world, but they still hold those views and feel strongly enough that they feel like they want to express them in some way. So it's still representative, but in the millions of people that we have, I don't know. And that's the case with everything, right? Like, that's what makes it so difficult to assess the reality that we live in. And then we have media, which this is, again, a gripe of mine, because I was very critical of the media landscape for a long time, because I saw a lot of issues, some ideological, some not. So I'm just like, they don't hire fact checkers anymore. Rates haven't moved. The incentive system, I think there's a lot that's broken just in the machinery of it, not necessarily even the ideology. But then you have the ideological leanings, of course, as well. And those were like legitimate grievances, I think, that a lot of people shared. But then what I see is like, we are the media now. Well, on the one hand, I'm happy for more people to create and do content and have platforms, whether that's podcasts or Substack or something like that. But it's like the expectations have gone down with them. The expectation of accuracy, the expectation of not being ideologically captured. I see these entities as often being far more ideologically captured. Maybe the fact that they're more blatantly so is a better thing. I don't know. Whereas mainstream media sort of does this act as if they are objective, but actually are not. And then, I think the right-wing ecosystem is very not doing that pretense.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, maybe that's better. Maybe that's more honest. And then you can decide, right? But the grievances that people had towards the left-wing system, they don't have towards the right wing. And the inaccuracies that happen, when people are citizen journalists, there's some people who are capable of extremely good citizen journalism, right? There are people who are careful and meticulous and get sources and will do excellent work. So it's not me gatekeeping, because, somebody went to school and somebody didn't. But then you have a lot that is just sensationalism. It's provably false, and it spreads, and it often gets more eyeballs than the people doing a good job. And so that is a problem. So and that spreads so much that, again, our sense of reality is so based on how much we see online and what information we're exposed to. I don't know 100% how to solve that, because it's like the monkey. Like, I think there are ways to solve that through technology, not censorship. I think things like community notes, imperfect as they are good tools. I think AI can help with, I see people using it this way, which I think is great. So somebody will make a claim or post a picture, all these shootings were done by this, this group of people or whatever, something like that. And I saw somebody post to Grok and be like, is this accurate? And I think that's a good use. It won't be perfect, obviously.
Yeah, but
it's better. It's a start. And I think we can use technology to improve. So people see more information rather than less. And then they can judge for themselves whether they believe what they've read is trustworthy. Maybe, tools that ask, here's the information that's missing, from this that you might want to consider. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can train ourselves to even be more meticulous at how we consume data and information and content.
It is exhausting.
And technology can help.
It's exhausting.
It is. It is, because and the thing is, there's no way that we can be an expert and all these different things. There's a lot that I don't comment on because I'm I haven't spent the time on that. I try to comment more on things that I feel like I've spent enough time on and research. I've fallen behind on certain things, so I don't comment on them anymore very much. And but we ultimately, our reality is still shaped by the stories around us. And because we can't fact check every single thing, we ultimately do believe many things that are probably false, unintentionally.
I was having a conversation earlier today that, talking to you and talking to you about your moment that led to the book in 2020. It does feel like we are still living in the shadow of essentially what I would call the atrocities committed on the general population by the elite broadly in 2020 and the subsequent years, the immediate years following. So COVID, mm-hmm. Black Lives Matter, the censorship industrial complex, the demonstrable, provable, we have the receipts, lying and gaslighting that went on at the hearts of basically everything that calls itself legitimate: academia, science, medicine, government. And that there's this sense oh, well, that was 5 years ago, move on. It's yeah, well, most of the people and the representatives of these institutions haven't apologized, haven't had any mea culpa, really. It's and that has maybe radicalized me a little bit in the sense that, I exist at the intersection. If you want to draw like Venn diagrams of right wingers, I'm very classical liberal in a lot of ways. And so I have my free market groups who think like, for example, that shade into never Trumper types. And then manosphere folks and post-liberals who are like, we need to kick all the Muslims out of Europe and make England English again. And I kind of sit there not in the middle saying like, the one thing all in common is all of the elite institutions lumped this whole group all Hitler, number one. And then number two, like locked us all up, lied to us, and tortured our kids along several different dimensions for years. And we're supposed to like go back to normal and act like, hey, you media corporation X, you should probably be shut down. You should be shut down. Like you're like a criminal enterprise. And
I hear that a lot. Yeah.
So there's like, oh no, now the right wing has got excesses. I'm not trying to say you're wrong about that. Like there's a kind where I bristle, and I had James Lindsay on the show and he talks about the woke right, and I didn't even bother talking to him about it. But where I bristle with some of that is, yes, that's bad, but can we please finish the job of addressing, like we haven't had the Nuremberg trials for the monsters yet of 2020. Are we going to get them? Was it just the 2024 election?
Yeah, I don't like the framing of the Nuremberg trials, but I'll explain in a second. Though we'll probably have some. I know.
Yeah.
Well, one
you
thing
get my
is,
point, though.
I do get your point. I think one thing is, what I hear a lot is like, well, we have to fight. It's basically fight fire with fire, right? We're tired of losing. We need to win.
I'm not even exactly saying that, but I do understand that point's there.
But that's what I hear from a lot of people on the right. And, once we have power and have fixed things up, we're going to go back to having principles. And I'm like, if you're willing to bend in them, why should I support you over the other group? Because that's kind of, to me, what they've done too. That I do not like. In terms of what you're speaking of making amends. So Nuremberg trial, the reason I don't like that framing, and I know you were exaggerating, is like, I think that a lot of the people doing what they did were well-intentioned, but, and I know the Nazis were well-intentioned too, so of course, but
everybody thinks they're the good guy, right? Yeah. Except for nihilists.
And there is no when it comes to the vaccines, I know that a lot of people think they're like absolute evil, and I don't believe that. I think there were clearly some injuries and some concerns, and they were shut down. And that is a serious problem. I also think the vaccine, you can look at the statistics of hospitalizations with the vaccine and without, and clearly the people who had been vaccinated had much better outcomes than those who were not, those who were hospitalized. So to me, that's informative. What had happened, though, in terms of shutting down businesses and, the dehumanization, actually, that was probably where I spoke up first. And I think that this predates my own experience. What I was seeing, I couldn't believe, even though I was somebody who started off the pandemic with I had the masks. I think I made a little skit about like all the things you should do. I sprayed down my boxes and everything. I got vaccinated voluntarily when it first, it became available.
I did too. I got the Pfizer shots. I was relying personally on the numbers coming out of Israel. Like that was the early.
Oh, really?
Those were the early data. It was like 500,000 data points. So, but even then, it was like looking back. We don't have to relitigate all of COVID right now, but I think that the thing is I think it's a true statement to say that let's leave aside the efficacy of the vaccine.
Yeah.
And what we experienced was very quickly. Policy
Authoritarian.
it was authoritarianism. It was like mini communism. It was like,
that's
okay.
what I think that's what really hit me very hard. So again, the reason I said that I did all these things because I wasn't objecting to these things. I was objecting to them being forced on people. I do believe in people's decisions. I had did a lot of research on like, okay, what has happened with previous vaccinations, what were the mandates for that? And it's just, this stood out as a very unique situation in terms of how things were pushed on people, how people were vilified for not, how illogical a lot of things were. And then when you're talking about making amends, it bothers me that more than an apology, I think what would be important is for these institutions to say, here's what we're learned, and this is what we're going to do different. Because clearly, even now, they have acknowledged that they got some things wrong, right? Even things like, they were saying that natural immunity wasn't a thing. Now we know it is. Like, there's a lot they got wrong.
Then.
5 feet.
It's like we knew. It's like, how do you think vaccines work? They expose your system to the virus.
Officially. I'm just talking about the official language today, right?
But
so they have come forward, right? But they haven't said, well, this is why we got it wrong, and this is what we're going to do different. And to me, it's like, okay, blame, we can always have blame for anything. For me, it's much more important. It's like, okay, what are you going to do different? And I think it is incredibly important for these institutions to take the responsibility. I do think there is a level of recognition that they need in terms of maybe a type of apology only to regain public trust, because public trust in the institutions is, even take something like, there were blatant lies. So for example, masking, okay? In the beginning, they said, you need masks. And then they're like, no, you actually don't need masks. And the reason was because they didn't want, the masks to not be available for medical, frontline medical people.
But the laundry list is sort of well established on the lies, right? Like the known lies, the things where it was like, we're going to say a thing that we know is false.
Because they think it's in the public interest.
Like 6 feet.
But
the CDC knew it was 12.
Yeah.
But they
so
do
once
6 feet.
Exactly. But once you are dishonest with the public ones, the public is just not going to trust you, even if you're telling the truth. And the damage from that, I think, is so severe. There's all these studies that show how low trust is in different institutions as well as media. They have to do something. And to me, the most trustworthy thing they can do is to say, this is where we failed, this is why, and this is what we're going to do different. And the failure was so large too, because you think about these situations, like something like the pandemic, they've modeled this, right? And prior to this happening, many of that, and all these countries had very similar policies too. So there's some kind of an exchange of ideas going on, but why did they get it so wrong? Like, I would want to understand that. Why did they? There's just a lot of like not controversial things. I'm not going to argue with people on vaccines, or I'm just arguing on the things that are like provably everyone agrees are false or bad policies. And why did they not model it better? Like, what's the failure that caused that? I want to know that. I think we need answers more than we need apologies. And I think we need plans for the future more than we need apologies. And I think that might be the only thing that will really get some of that trust back. And I think some people are so far gone.
It's, when I think about how to navigate this world of information, there's a couple, and be like engaged in it, because obviously we can go about our daily lives and just turn off the news, and that's probably mostly good and mostly healthy for most people, actually. But it's like, you might not care about politics, but politics cares about you. So that's the challenge. You can say, I'm going to just shut off from all of this, and then and Islamo-communist ends up being the mayor of America's biggest city. And I guess now we're doing that. So I think that we're sort of, I'm a small government guy. And that at the most fundamental level, it's because like central planning can't work even in theory, right? Like the reason why the place of your birth was a disaster is because communism doesn't work in theory. Forget practice. Practice is just like a murder factory. But even in theory, it's literally impossible.
Well, in theory, I think communism is meant to be a utopia where everyone agrees on this, right? Which can't work in practice.
Well, and it's like in theory, it also makes requirements that are metaphysical. It's basically a satanic religion. Because it says, okay. No, I mean,
tell me how you really feel.
Well, so I'm going to test some hyperbole on you since you don't like it, this is one of them. So what do I mean? What do I mean by that? So there's actually people today who call themselves Satan worshipers, and they're just atheists, right? No, I mean like literally. I don't mean all atheists are Satan worshipers.
Okay.
What I mean is like, there is like the Church of Satan is just a materialist atheist thing. It's not like, we literally worship the devil.
Okay, you're talking about, okay, yeah.
So, but like Karl Marx was like obsessed with Mephistopheles. He was fundamentally a materialist. He believed in the deconstruction of humanity, and his vision required a post-scarcity utopia. So like that, it's weird to me that conquered half of planet Earth, murdered 100 million people, and we're still having that dialogue today about whether or not that's good in theory or actually kind of you're a good person if you just want to help people and you call yourself a communist or democratic socialist or whatever. And there's something broken in us about that. But I find myself, I say this on the channel, you can look at the thumbnails. Like, I want to call that out for what it is. And there's times where like the subtleties are sort of a scam. And it's like, no, that is fundamentally just sort of Marxist communist collectivism. And when like Zoran Mamdani, for example, is saying, well, no, we want to seize the means of production. That's what he wants. He says that, I believe him. So we're in really weird times on this front where navigating to kind of come back to my question earlier, like when does something that feels like harsh and hyperbolic turn out to be correct, and decorum. Like I don't know what the role of what's the new decorum going to be?
I have an obsession with being as precise and descriptive of something as I can, and so that's why sometimes the hyperbole, like I have this reaction to it.
It's a healthy thing to react that way.
Yeah. In terms of my own, because I started out, when I had any kind of political leanings, I would say I was a hardcore capitalist because I was an immigrant. And I think that's a common thing.
Yeah.
And I would say I was like a libertarian because it pissed people off when I was in my very left-leaning communications department in school. And I wasn't particularly afraid, I think, of pissing people off in that way. And, but also I thought because of the hardcore capitalism, and then I have personal liberties. I just like a lot of freedom for people, as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's freedoms.
So thumbs up on Ayn Rand, Soviet, Jewish, immigrant.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did an interview with the Atlas Society a while ago. But I would say my views have evolved from that to a mishmash. I believe now in a mishmash of things. I just don't think that any one system can capture the reality that we live in and what we need as a population. So, I don't think that libertarianism works in this purest way. I don't think, communism does, socialism does, or any other systems. I think that, or capitalism. I don't believe in capitalism purely just leave it all, because you get monopolies. So I do think there needs to be a level of regulation from the government. But I would say, what's the smartest regulation? What's the lowest amount of regulations that you can apply for things to function well? Now, the problem that we often have with the government is oversteps, overregulates, and that creates problems.
The ratchet effect.
And then the other, yeah,
they break
and then
things
the other
and then
thing,
they put themselves forward as the solution to the thing they broke.
Sure. The other thing for me is, I guess this is my more socialist leaning elements, is I do believe people should, in a society, we live in different countries. I think that people, when they fall, and need help, I think there should be a social system that catches them. And that includes a welfare system, healthcare. And that depends on how you apply it also. And I think there could be, socialized healthcare has a lot of problems. So does the American system of healthcare. Lots of problems.
We basically have socialized healthcare in this country.
Well, you have Medicaid. I was just speaking to a friend of mine about this. So apparently Medicaid is pretty good. But then you've got...
Medicaid? You mean Medicare? Medicare.
Medicare, sorry. And
Medicaid
when you... No, okay. I see my error. But when you have, for example, if you have insurance and it's a good insurance, then usually things work out pretty well. But for example, if you're a freelancer and you're spending a minimum of $2,000 or you lost your job, you're not dirt poor, but you are, this is where it's a problem. I think all systems have their cons and pros. And it's like, okay, how can you learn to put together the best possible system you can? And that might be a system that's part public, part private. And there's always room for improvement. But that's why I don't think it should just be one thing or just the other thing. I think, if you're a senior living on a pension, you should have some care given to you. Or if you're a veteran, or if you lost your job and don't have any other means of healthcare. And that is a socialist element, right? And I know some people don't agree with that. Tough. Fair enough. And I'm happy to hear your reasoning. But that's where I'm at with, I think I like to mix and match, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to go down a total econ rabbit hole. The reason why I've been talking about this stuff more here is I think that frankly, I think the president is muddying the waters in ways that I find really upsetting. Taking stakes of companies, shaking down others for a VIG. So it's like, oh, we don't want and so it's.
I think the tariffs are.
It's like there's argument like if we could eliminate all productive taxes and have just an excise tax, a tariff, I'd be for that. It'd be great. We would need to go back to a world where the government is 5% of GDP, which I would also like. I think that the thing that 2020, I find it somewhat inescapable. That 2020 revealed just how corrupt centralized power is. I'm kind of amazed that it didn't utterly discredit government-run healthcare. Because the whole thing was like, okay, so now we have totalitarianism by the health institutions that 15 minutes ago Bernie Sanders wanted to be entirely run by these people. These are the people. This is what they're doing when they have total control. Like, case closed. Now, that's my take. Obviously, that's
if you have competition, that's usually better. Like for, if you have different providers. Actually, like Israel has this system where they have multiple insurance companies, basically. It's socialized healthcare, but so everyone gets like a voucher. And
it's sort of
there's
like
multiple insurance
socialism.
Companies.
Yeah.
So essentially it creates kind of, because you can switch. And so it creates a competition level. And then you can also pay for extra services and upgrade. So you get the base, but you don't get the extras. I think that's not a bad system, probably.
There's a lot of systems that in some sense could sound more socialized that would actually be improvements on the U.S. from my perspective.
Germany has an interesting system. I mean, from what I looked at, it's got the highest.
Switzerland, I think, is the
Switzerland?
best. Personally,
Switzerland?
They've got like a more, they've got private insurance. But the point,
Germany has a mix. Yeah.
The point is, we're never going to have perfection. there's libertarian utopianism just as much as there is communist utopianism.
There is.
Right? We're not going to live in a world
Yeah.
that has no forms of governance, and we're all like autonomous individuals that somehow still have private property. I guess with private courts adjudicating our disputes. Like, that'd be great. That's called heaven. Here on earth, we're still going to have. I'd like to move us as close to that as possible, but I guess how do you, you're trying to navigate the middle lane. How do you think about the values that are not up for grabs? What are the things for you that aren't about moderation? There's was it Jefferson was like, it was, I'm going to bungle this, but it was like radicalism in the defense of liberty is no vice. I got that almost right. But there's values for which they are a fundamental principle. They are not hedged. What are those for you?
Yeah, and I guess that's where I'm not like always looking for exact. I'm trying to look for as much common ground as I can, but for example, personal freedoms, that's like a non-negotiable for me. So we can talk about when it infringes on other people, right? Because that's no longer just a personal freedom. But when it comes to your own choice over your own body or your own, this is why I guess I supported people in their, not in their choice not to get vaccinated, for example, because it is in that realm. So it's those personal freedoms. So that includes transitioning if you're an adult. We can discuss children, but like adults, I think are that's their right to do as they wish with their bodies. I am generally pro legalizing substances because I think it's up to. I am pro that personally.
I am too, even though they're a disaster.
I'm not supporting them.
No,
I don't think they're good. There's a lot of things that I support people's personal freedom over that, sexual freedoms. It doesn't mean that I engage in the same things or agree with them, but I do. That is a fundamental non-negotiable for me. And there's, so there's definitely several things like that, that and other things where I'm like often reconsidering my positions. There is definitely things where I am unsure. Freedom of speech would also be one. Obviously, I wouldn't have written the book that I have if that wasn't something that I valued. I think America is a very unique country in the sense that, you have that First Amendment. No other country has that level of freedom. And that's constantly, you're seeing it's under attack in Europe, in a lot of Arab countries obviously never, it's funny, we don't really talk about them because it's like we almost take it for granted that they don't have the levels of freedom.
They somehow managed to escape being part of the like history of slavery conversation as well.
Oh yeah, that's true. So it's
even going back to the 1619 time, it's like, well, where was the trade more dominant actually? Who got more of the slaves actually? Never mind.
Even compared to England right now is not great on freedom of speech. They're arresting people for like memes and stuff, but and song lyrics. But if you live in Afghanistan, your freedom of speech is far, far, far more limited. So we have a lot of degrees. When I wrote the book, No Apologies, How to Find It for Your Voice in the Age of Outrage. Thank you.
Check it out on Amazon. Good reviews there.
Thank you. It's one of those things where, I was predominantly looking at speech, kind of censorship from institutions and from individuals, right? And social speech limitations are very, it's a very important issue to tackle. Doesn't mean that I don't think anyone should ever feel any repercussions for any speech. You might not want to associate with someone who says certain things that you think are awful. That is also your free choice, your personal liberty. You might not want to work with that person. That's also, I advocate for more tolerance and more ability to have better discourse and to be more good faith, not necessarily to never like judge anybody's speech. That would be ridiculous. However, and I think social pressures are incredibly powerful in limiting what we can talk about, what our policies end up being, laws. So it is incredibly important that we have a wide scope of what we're willing to discuss in good faith. But when it comes to, I often get asked, which is worse, government censorship or social censorship? And I think government is far worse.
Yes.
And I think, because it's like, that's the ability of the government to put you in prison, maybe even take your life, for speech, for words and ideas. And I think that is very dangerous. So this is where my concern is. It's interesting because for the longest time you had people on the left be like, oh, I'm for freedom of speech, but except for hate speech. Okay, how do you define hate speech, right?
Right.
And they're experiencing that now, especially with like the pro-Palestine kind of protests. And by the way, the limit for me would be incitement of violence. I definitely, that is a hard, and probably more than the law in the US. I think it's very hard to prove incitement, I think, but and it's a very narrow kind of definition. At the same time, you don't want people to go to jail for being like, I'm going to beat you up. I hate you. I
No,
wish
there's
you
a
burned.
specific, there's strong case law on this. And we used to have institutions like the ACLU that would, defend Nazi rallies as a matter of not being incitement. And now they're just woke. They're like a woke,
I think
charred
FIRE
husk.
does do a good job as kind of the replacement, because I've seen them on different sides of issues, and I don't always agree with the thing that they're defending, but they're right to defend it, and so I respect them very much. So but now, because of like what has been happening with some of the Palestinian rallies and all that kind of stuff, and you now have people on the left talking about, censorship and how important free speech is. And it's like, I predicted this. I've been warning you this. This is like, you don't like what they say, okay. But if you allow these rules and laws and the way these things are worked to continue, like, power changes hands all the time. Do you really want Trump, who you really, really hate, to have that kind of power? And I think people only think about it when that power is in their hands. And it's just so hypocritical to me. And I've sort of asked myself this question morally. It's like, should I defend someone's right to speech who would not defend mine, or other people's who would actually actively shut down their speech? Some people say yes, and I've asked people this, and some people say no. And I'm a little bit torn, honestly.
When his name is escaping me now, he was sort of became a proxy for the campus pro-Palestine rallies. I think his name was Mahmoud. I might be misremembering.
Mahmoud Khalid?
Yes.
Yeah.
I did a video about that, looking at it, and I fundamentally said he has a green card, he has rights, he also has things that he swore to that are areas of debate about whether what he was doing sort of is a violation of those things.
Yeah, but people wouldn't be debating those areas if it wasn't speech that they disagreed with. That's kind of the thing for me, because I'm like, go ahead.
I ultimately came down in defense of his freedom of speech rights. I think and I think this is,
me too.
I think it's more true. The UK seems like it's facing things that are different than the US, although maybe not as much. And I will say I've gotten more sensitive to this than I used to. And that is, it could be the case that the UK is basically being invaded. That you have a rising level and I'm just going to say, of Islamic population that fundamentally doesn't hold the values of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think all 5 of its major cities' mayors are now Muslim. And I have theological problems with Islam. I don't have problems with Islamic people. They're just human beings. But I think the theology is wrong. But the actual like philosophy of the theology, it is anti-Western. It is against the basic presuppositions of the thing we call the West. And so there is a point here, and it's a real challenge for me. I'm not saying I know the answer here. I kind of don't. But where does toleration let the Trojan horse be brought into your country? And then it's like, oh, we'll tolerate you right up until, oh, now you're running the place. Oh, and you're intolerant and you hate us. I don't think that's a non-trivial concern. I think that's like a real concern.
I guess my moderate position on, immigration is that, like, I'm an immigrant, right? So I'm grateful to have been allowed to immigrate. I absolutely embrace Western values and all of that. Many immigrants do. I think the problem is when you allow too much immigration too quickly from just one particular population, any population. And also you don't have assimilation and you don't have any shared values. So I think the process has to be slower and it has to be, more diverse in terms of like, you don't admit just one group of people. You over time, of course, you have refugees and things like that, and those are urgent situations, but they don't have to be granted necessarily, they can have temporary status, and then maybe like they can then go through an immigration process if they live there long enough and they are in good standing and all that kind of stuff. So that's one way to handle it. And what's happening, and I think it's also good for the immigrants because if you need programs to provide better assimilation, that's language, that's also cultural exposure. I mean, my family and I, we like when we moved to North America, we like immediately we watched all the American movies and shows, and I think that has an impact, and you learn the language. My grandparents who moved when they were older still bothered to learn English, and I think that's a big part of it. And then you don't cluster in just one group of people because that happens too. Like, and that's true of any population. When we're talking about Islamism specifically, from my understanding of what's happening in the UK so I think it's something like 5 or 6%. So that's a pretty big demographical change. And there's a tendency, I think, to have more kids. I think people follow Islam or Muslim, like any religion, there's extreme things in the texts. And, that's true of Christianity, Judaism. We just don't follow these extreme things to the T, right? We're moderate. We don't stone people in the Jewish text, if a wife had an affair, you stone her. And yes, there's different interpretations, but during that time period, I'm sure that happened. Today, we would never do that, as well as many other things. And I think that's, and same with like Muslims. I think there is a lot of moderate Muslims that they just don't follow it so perfectly. And then there is like a percentage, maybe it's been estimated, like 8-10% that follow it, very radically, very hardcore. But you have a huge number of people who are Muslim. So that 10% then becomes a big number. And because the people who live in England, for example, they haven't quite assimilated, and they have their own very communities where you can just be there and never talk English, or, I'm sure many of them do learn English, but like you can be just within your own community. So they have Sharia law courts, for example. Now, this is kind of like a voluntary thing, right? Like it's not like the UK, you hear about it and it's so dramatic, right? Like the UK doesn't have Sharia law. Sharia. I'm sorry, I'm like being, my pronunciations today are very off. I have a speech impairment, but but I think that it's not something that the UK has, but their communities do have that, and they choose to live under that. But from what I understand, some of them are also saying, well, everything should have, like the entire UK should be Muslim, and it's a religion of conversions. Like Christians at one point, right, went on crusades and were quite a dangerous bunch because they were trying to convert people forcefully. Today, Christians might come up to you and be like, I really want you to discover Jesus because I really love him and he, will save your soul or something like that. And it's like, fine, you might feel a little uncomfortable if you're not Christian, but like, that's not the same.
Some sloppy history there, Kath.
Okay. Call me on my sloppiness.
Well,
that's fine.
It's okay. It is what it is.
Set the record straight.
Well, I think at least the first Crusades saved Europe because it was actually a defensive act against the Islamic invasion of the West. So
okay.
Because all of the Middle East was actually Christian and Islam was spread by force by the sword.
But there was also conversion.
It was coming in on Istanbul and Constantinople, and they were closing in on Rome. And basically, it was like, well, we could either repel the Islamic hordes that are trying to take over all of Europe.
I get it. Everyone's always worrying for power and control. You see that as a positive because you align more with that side. You think it's much better.
No, I'm just saying this is maybe where we differ temperamentally to some extent and maybe on particular issues, but whether it's the particular issues or side, I think you're doing something which is understandable, which is like, well, let's find the moderate middle, and sure, all religions have problems, and can't we all just get along? And I think the question I wanted to probe you on, though, I do think Islam serves as a challenge to the West. And I think it's theologically, I'm not some expert, but we're way off in the weeds here. I had a 6-month period in which I engaged in a discourse with someone I'd known for a long time who I discovered had converted to radical Islam and was sending me, like video footage he took himself from the streets of Tehran during the funeral of the president that died, and so for about 6 months I was engaged in this almost like experiment with this person who I knew from a time before he converted into radical Islam, and he would tell me he fundamentally wants to see the West destroyed. And I'm like, you are talking about we like each other, or we used to, or I think we still kind of do, although you're frightening, but you are talking about me and my family dying. And he's like, yeah, I know. Yeah. It's like, I'm not going to personally do it, but that is what I ultimately want. And it changed. It did change the way I think about this in the sense of it made us like, no, man, okay. This is like a author who is a very smart guy, clearly prone towards radical flights of fancy. But there's something going on here. And I think even if we even want to take the Islam part out of it, it does speak to this question. This is about your book, and your story is fundamentally about how do we preserve open dialogue, right? How do we not have Maoism and self-censorship and struggle sessions in our culture, and be tolerant and not let extremes hold us captive? Would you think that's a fair,
yeah, absolutely,
sort of portrayal of what you're trying to do?
Yeah.
And I think the challenge I have, and I don't have an answer, and I'm just curious, is if there is, what is the limit to that tolerance? Where should a tolerant society, a small L classical liberal society, draw the line and say, nope, you are a fifth column.
See, I think to me, it's when you are wanting to take away those personal liberties. And Islamism does want to do that, right? It's one thing when people are like, we're going to just practice certain things ourselves, versus no, we want this to be the system under which your country runs. And I think in terms of immigration, by the way, I think countries have the right to decide for themselves what kind of immigrants they want to take. It might be the brain drain thing. Sucks for those other countries, but like I get it, right? Like you want highly skilled or talented people to come. And that's, ultimately you're getting immigrants for the most part to improve your country in some way, to benefit the country. Sometimes you take refugees because those are, extreme conditions.
They're not usually all military age men, by the way, refugees.
Yeah, for
sort of
sure.
like always like, oh, I'm a refugee. It's like,
no, and I remember I watched a really good lecture for a woman with a woman who works on the whole refugee thing, and she said, "Well, what's happening?" And I think this was a really good way of framing it. I think that's what's happening, is that the refugees aren't accepted based on actual need. The system is really broken. So there's a lot of people coming in who haven't been properly vetted, also don't necessarily have the need. And that's why you're getting these military age men as opposed to, people who are, maybe escaping tyranny, maybe they said the wrong thing or they're gay or whatever, right? They're not being properly classified.
like third generation people are also typically not. Like you can't inherit your refugee status as a child. Like,
yes,
or as a grandchild. That's weird. Like I'm a refugee.
Yeah,
and so is my grandfather. It's like, what?
See, if I say that, I get called an evil, whatever. But
it's not. It's something else.
True.
It's not. You're not a refugee.
It is something else. I agree with that. I don't really understand that. It's because it's also not being applied equally. If it was, discuss it and debate it, but it's not. It's only one group of people. But I think that in general, I know Hungary has a pretty restrictive immigration policy. They want to maintain their culture, right? Japan. I like living in a country that's got more diversity personally, but
yeah, me too.
I also think those countries have the exactly, which is a very
we're special. Canadian. America's special. Oh, right. You're Canadian, so you're getting used to a new kind of communism then.
Yeah.
Well, you and Gad Sad can come to America to escape the eventual pogroms there. Right. I'm sorry to say.
Well, I was very willing to be an American patriot. Now I'm like, I like a lot about Canada. There's a lot to criticize there too. I also like a lot about America, and there's a lot to criticize too. But I spent a lot of time in the U.S., and there's a lot that I really admire about it, and some things I don't. But when it comes to what were you talking about?
Well, it's just I think
immigration,
and the limits to tolerance. Yeah. I think the limits to tolerance is.
I don't think you should take people who don't share your values inherently. So, for example, when my family came to North America, the reason that we wanted to is because we share those values. We were pursuing the freedoms, the so-called American or Canadian dream, work hard, prosper kind of thing, mm-hmm. Not necessarily be a millionaire, but just you can have a decent life. And I think that's still true. If you have some skill, talent, and, yes. and work hard, you can have a decent life. And you're not restricted based on your, when we were in the Soviet Union, that thing about everyone being equal was not true. And being Jewish, this was, in terms of systemic discrimination, that way, you literally had it on your birth certificate that you're Jewish, you were the other, and you couldn't go to, medical school. Some people got to go to medical schools because, we have a lot of Jewish doctors, but it's because, bribes or people bribe to change things on their birth certificate, things like that. There were certain areas that everyone knew they were just not open to Jews. And my parents didn't want me to live like that. And so I think it's important that the people you bring into your country align with your values. I don't care about somebody's skin color or race, but I do care about value. And I think that's where, and I think it's okay also for some countries to preserve cultures. Like Japan. I really like, Japan is not a perfect country. It has a lot of issues and we kind of whitewash it a lot, but it's a cool country to visit. and it has a very clear Japanese culture. And I think they have the right to like restrict immigration, make it slow and limited to maintain that, if that's what the people want. And I also think that America or Canada can choose to have more immigration policies that maybe are a little bit more open and generous. But I think we should be focusing on bringing people who have shared values. And if somebody's coming to the West and they hate the West, then I don't think they should be coming, which I don't understand why you would want to go to the West in the first place if you don't share the values of the West.
I am very divided on this in the sense that I'm very broadly pro-immigration. My default position is fairly radically libertarian in general. But I think I totally agree with you. And I also think we don't even go far enough in thinking about that sometimes, in the sense that, like, well, all the institutions we were talking about at the start of our conversation, they produce people that hate the West. You know, the 1619 Project is an act of hatred of the country, from my perspective. I think quite explicitly. It's also been basically called bunk history by the leading American historians, including people like Gordon Wood, who've been on the show, who are just like, this is just nonsense. But it's nonsense through a particular worldview that I think is empirically false, but that is very broadly held in the kinds of institutions that have been corrupted by woke stuff. And that is, there's something rotten about the sort of Western, and this used to, I would say, Western liberalism, as in like individual liberty liberalism and meritocracy. And it's somehow uniquely white supremacist and racist and all the isms, all the like thought terminating cliches that, you know, we should all basically be inoculated to and laugh at when people throw them at us. But this is stuff that is still right now, to this day, even here in 2025, the dominant dialogue and discourse in most of academia, and it bleeds out into a lot of other areas. And it's like it's an act of self-hatred. It's like, no, we need the issue is always the revolution. And so the thing that's weird in the American context for me is, unlike Europe, you know, like our immigrants are like Mexicans that are coming here and want to work, like Catholic Mexicans who want to work. I'm more worried about the graduates of Columbia who hate the country and want to burn it to the ground and vote for some Islamo-communist for mayor.
What do you think is behind that? Because I agree with you. There's a tendency to be like, to hate America, right? America's bad. Everything America's, even when you compare it, I mean, other countries don't have that level of self-loathing. And yes, America has some bad things in its history, 100%. Sure. But, you know, we North Americans, we've recovered largely from that. I think it's one of the freer countries, the most tolerant countries. It
is the country in which one of the things, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it is the country, and we can loop Canada in for North America, but the West more broadly though, but especially the United States. All the things that this ideology claims to care about, we're number one in, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the planet. Oh, you want broad plural rights to groups and protection of minorities. You want equality for women in law. You want, like, we did it all. Oh, how about like the West is the culture that like radically sought to abolish slavery? We did that. We the West.
So what do you think is really behind that level of hate? Like, is that something we're importing, or I mean, I do think there is some foreign interference. I mean, there is lots of evidence for that. Different countries, you know, I guess I won't name them all, but
sure.
But there is definitely evidence.
Confucian centers.
It's something, yes. But there's also something about it that, you know, what they do is they usually amplify rifts that are already there. So how do you think they got in there in the first place?
Good question. I think that sort of communism, and I'm saying that, I know it's like that sort of drive towards the collective mindset is kind of built into all of us to some extent. The family unit is communistic. We don't write property contracts among family, generally speaking.
Sure.
Sometimes they're actually useful, but generally speaking, we don't do that. And so there is an intuition about, and some of us are more sensitive to this than others, but we have intuitions about oppression, about boundaries, about what's fair, and they don't tend to scale great. So I think there's a honest center of gravity one can hold, that when you hear communistic ideas, and I'm lumping that all broadly together, that's my inclination, but it's all basically the same stuff to me. It's this.
But it's also like, it's more than communist, because a lot of countries will tend towards communism, but it's that level of self-hate and blaming, and like America is so bad, that I do think is a bit unique.
It's all
in the US.
To me. It is. It really is. And I mean that. And I say this I've said this to my son over the years, and he was like, "Dad, it's not all communists. You sound like a grumpy old man." As he's aging and reading more, he's like, "You're kind of right." You just scratch the surface. They scratch the surface on the history of queer theory, and literally everybody calls themselves a Marxist. You scratch the surface and read any of the people at critical race theory, they're all Marxists. I mean, like, they say it themselves.
I guess this is a James Lindsay conversation, because he's like,
but I mean, I think that's a statement of fact. You go back to the 1960s radicalism, they're Marxist. Now, what is it? Well, I'm trying to be charitable, actually, because I think there's actually just a fundamental core, and that core is a desire. There's two flavors of it from my perspective. One is rank nihilism, which is there's no such thing as good and evil. I don't know what, get mine. The world is only power. I think postmodernism is all that. It's just a nihilistic view that there is no such thing as goodness. So take what you can get. The world's a power game. Grab the ring of power. Then I think there's a more benign but just as demonic in its outcomes version, which is sharing is caring, and why can't everything be sharing and caring? And, I'm off-put by accumulation, and that triggers some tribal old school circuitry. So I don't like that. And you should tax away Jeff Bezos and Elon's money and give it to the poor. And that makes me a good person. You're not taking it from me. So it's a luxury belief, but I'm still coming from a place of caring. And so I think those are like these intuitions that get hijacked by a class of intellectuals and activists. And I think it's perfect. It's perfect, like mutant baby is Queers for Palestine. And it's like, it seems like it's irrelevant, except ask all those kids, they all want communism. So it's like, and they don't even know what it means. So when you really ask, and I know I'm sort of riffing here and I'm going off on some blathering tangent, but when you go into the crowd and you say, well, what do you want? Well, we want revolution. We want total change. We want to overturn the system. They don't know what they want. You go to the Chop/Chaz in Seattle in 2020, and you say, what will rise from the ashes? And every one of their phoenixes looks completely different. It's incoherent, but it's all coming from the same basic impulses to me. And
what's scary to me is that it's going in a more violent direction, it seems to me. Again, don't know how representative, but I am hearing more on both sides, right? I think with conservatives, it was like they were just so frustrated at not having any like institutional power that they feel like civil war, right? Is that's the buzzword. And then with on the left, it's kind of crazy too. Like I hear, well, the justification of killing that CEO, for example, right? The celebration of the guy who did it.
We saw that on the right,
but also
too,
like
actually.
Outright. Oh yeah. Well, it's the horseshoe, right?
Yeah.
I see a lot of that. It's including the hate towards America. Like there is so much of that on the right, where they so align, just maybe for different reasons, but it's the same outcome almost. And there's just something, this willingness to, use force, because to really have a very strong fundamental change in any structure in any way, that has been historically done through bloody revolutions. People want more than two parties. Okay, in the US, well, how do you, like, that's a very difficult thing to do, because both parties are going to cling to power, and they have all this power already. So to have like a third party, you can use democratic forces, but it's not very realistic, it seems, to a lot of people.
Well, and it's a panacea. Look at Europe; they've got 15 parties, and they're all.
It's got its own flaws and coalition governments, and I think it's more democratic to have more options. I think I would rather have more options personally, but I also understand what the negative implications of that would be. In Canada, we have three parties, now four parties, but really we only have two also, and that have any realistic chance of winning. I guess that's kind of how it settles in a lot of cases. But I think that there is this real dissatisfaction with the status quo, and more discourse about using violence and violence as justification, because everyone thinks that they are morally, because they're right, and therefore it's justified in their case, not in the other guy's case, but just in their case. And it's kind of scary to see that conversation. And I do think it also further gets more extreme because of social media, because they're meeting more like-minded people. Whereas, like, if you said that, in a room, most people would be like, dude, you're insane. What are you talking about? But now they're talking to a bunch of other people who think the same way, and they feel like there is that strength in that, and power, and that sense of empowerment. And that is like worrying to me. I don't know how worried I should be, but it is worrying. And this is why we do need more discourse about difficult topics, including like hearing people say things that might be very uncomfortable and we may not like, because at least they feel some satisfaction in getting that out. It's this is where speech just really matters, and it's hard sometimes to sit through like really terrible speech and not, where I'm concerned is that we have some of these things just being superficially amplified, and also there is no pushback. Like, sunlight is the best disinfectant. That idea is not real in today's age, because those groups, instead of being like, hey, let's push back on those bad ideas with good ideas, in reality, you don't get to do that. Those people just find more of those people who share their ideas that are more radical, and they hang out with each other, and they don't get pushback, and they actually grow because they now find a community of like-minded people. That is worrying. And it's like something we couldn't have necessarily predicted very well that technology was going to do, but that's what technology did.
I think you're totally right about that. I think that it is in some ways I think it's an almost existential crisis for the human creature, because it's a kind of hijacking of our like basic psychological, like lizard brain ways. We're a tribal creature. We want to conserve our resources, right? So a quick get that you're on my team, and you're not coming over the hill to stab me and steal my stuff and plunder, but okay, good. All right. Okay. Like, you got the blue paint. Got it. All right. let's go. Now we're gonna go have dinner together. Oh, red paint. Oh no. Like, okay, you're coming to steal my stuff and kill my family. Like that hardware is still fully enforced with us. And it's very difficult and dangerous to navigate these times like this with these platforms and these like, kind of Asperger's folks that are managing them and designing them and tweaking them in ways that none of us really understand. And then you throw AI into the mix, and it all just sort of feels like it's going off the rails half the time these days. We've been talking for a long time. I ask every guest the same final question on their first visit to the show. But before I get to that one, I'm curious as we wrap things up. What do you think? Did you have fun? Am I a crazy crank? Did we have a good dialogue here? It's sort of this all got prompted by getting called out. What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. I think at that point I was in my more feisty, angry phase. I've mellowed a little bit since then, but I think it speaks well that, given how this started, that we ended up having this conversation. I think it's really good that we had areas of disagreement, I think in a healthy way. And I want to see more of that in the landscape. Like, I think we need more of that. And this is what I find in general is like, if I get invited on a more conservative show, it's usually to talk about things that people agree with me, and that's it, right? And I get it, but and I'm happy to talk about things we agree about as well. We do agree about on certain topics for sure. But also, I think it's nice to disagree and do that without vilifying each other and, more to understand each other's perspective, I think, than even to convince the other person of something. And I think just understanding that other person's perspective is important and showing that there are different perspectives, and that just because somebody has a different perspective doesn't mean that they're like an evil person or insane or stupid, which I hope is the case here on my end. So I'm glad we did this. I think there were like definitely moments of discomfort for me. And that discomfort just shows me that there's still things that I'm a little bit afraid to speak about, that I still have. I think I went through a phase where didn't really have those limits, and I feel them kind of almost coming back. And that's a reminder that speech is a muscle. A free speech is a muscle.
Yeah.
And it's not like I want to be there saying horrible things, but I do want to be free to say what I mean. And I can feel myself starting to clamp up a little. And even though I have said what I think, there were definitely moments where I felt like, oh, this is I'm a little scared of this. Like, oh, we're going into this topic. And that's sad that I feel that way. And the whole reason I started this journey of speaking and writing the book is because I spent so much time feeling that way. And I knew so many people who felt that way. And I thought it was important to express that, both the discomfort with that and also the importance of speaking.
I think I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think that it's an interesting thing to like really pay attention to when we're uncomfortable about things we're saying, right? And it's it's there's a couple ways you can approach that feeling. If I can give, I don't even know if I want to give advice per se, but the way I think about this is, as I've been doing this now, is you can embrace being someone that doesn't give an F, right? And is therefore like saying whatever. And that can become part of your identity. And that can have its moments of being like, useful and healthy and truth-telling, and then it can shade into being a purely provocative person that's essentially provoking to get a rise out of people or to build your status, and it becomes a status tool.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if you're feeling uncomfortable because you believe something's true, but you feel like that saying the true thing is dangerous.
Yeah.
I think that's a bad place to be. And I think that this is not just for you, this is for anybody listening. For myself. I've decided I'm not going to do that anymore. And I know you have too. I mean, that's what your book is about. That's what your work on Twitter and your writing is about broadly. But I guess my advice on this front is, if you really are an adult that understands kind of what your core values are, who you are, like stripped of social status and job, like we have like an identity fundamentally that is a core identity, and then it's got all these like layers on top.
Mm-hmm.
That should be the play. That should be like where you go to recharge the battery for that fight, to me.
I will add this to that, and this is advice my mother gave to me. I was going to make a joke about Trump like ages ago, and she's like, "Don't do it." But the reason, she said, if this is something that's important for you to say, then do it. Then make the joke or say the thing. If you're just doing it to like provoke attention or that sort of thing, then don't do it. So I think. And it feeds into what you were saying. It's about your values. So, and I test myself on this all the time, because there was a time where I think, I was saying all these different things and I was getting a lot of attention, and it's addictive, right? You're like, and when you don't get it, it's like, oh,
nobody cares anymore. I guess I'm not
nobody
interesting.
cares anymore. It's right. But I always like try to test myself. I'm like, am I saying this because this is actually important? Is there a reason for me to say this, right? Is there some value to me saying this? Or am I saying this to jump on the bandwagon or to please my audience? And then if it's the latter, then I don't do it. And it's the former, I do it. And I often still feel a little scared, right? And the truth is, it's scary because there's consequences. I'm very unprotected. I don't have a tribe, to protect me. I don't have like a full-on security blanket. So there's consequences to saying things, and I'm much better at living with the disagreeable part of it, where it's like, okay, people are going to be mad at me. Like I can deal with that a lot better now than when I first started in this. But there's still other life consequences, right? I get death threats. I get work opportunities get taken away. And the things that I do are dependent on other people to some extent, right? And because I'm not, it's very hard for someone like me who's not as provocative to build, a highly paying kind of audience, right? Like, so that's not really a path. And so,
well, you don't want to take a path for that reason either, right? Because that's sort of personally corrupting.
Of course it is, of course. And I will say this, like, quite honestly, I've never taken that path at all. I've pissed off my audience. I do say what I think. And I know, though, sometimes there are times where I'm like, I know I'm going to get a lot of pushback for saying this. I still say it. The fear is there, right? It hasn't 100% gone away. I know for some people, they don't have that. I do. And I still choose to say what I want, what I think is important. I hope one day that there is no fear, but it's also okay if there is, because the actions that we take do have consequences. You just have to be willing to stand by them. And it's the case, it's like, when people don't speak up, when they see something that's happening that they don't agree with or that's wrong because they're afraid, that fear is real. There is consequences. But despite the fear, there's another price to pay if people remain silent. And that price one day could be your job and another day could be your life. And that, I think, is why it's so important to speak. So the fact that I just admitted that it's still scary for me, it's okay. I think it's important for people to understand that.
We called this show Dad Saves America because I think as a man, especially, it's a role we get to play. If we're lucky, that is really high impact. And I think it does ultimately build the nation. It starts in the family, then expands out from there. You're a North American and you're not a man, but how do you think of your role in the North American story?
As a person towards kids, or
in general? A lot of it is what we're talking about, but just in your work, in your life, what are you trying to accomplish?
Well, I am trying to accomplish, I want people to have better dialogue, and I want to encourage people to speak with other people with whom they may disagree and have empathy and understand where people are coming from. And also help people give people a little bit of courage and permission to speak, because I saw that had an impact when I first started speaking out. Other people started speaking out, and so I want to be that ripple. And I also want to see people, I want people to see that there is an opposition to some of these radical ideas. I think that's really important for people to see that it's for the people who feel like they have to be silent. I want them to see that there are other people who actually think like them, and maybe they shouldn't be so silent. So I would say that's a big part of it. And then I also wanted people to see things in a, buzzword is nuance, but that is really what I do a lot of in my work, is like, okay, let's look at this not from this polarizing position, but let's look at the facts, break down the basic facts, and then let's analyze it in a rational way. And that's what I try to do in my work. And when it comes to kids, that I'm not working with kids right now. I have taught, but I think the biggest thing that a teacher or someone like that can do, or a parent, is spark their imagination and curiosity. I think, and this also applies to adults. I think curiosity is a fundamental thing, because curiosity leads to people searching for answers. It leads to people wanting to understand how other people feel or think about things. Curiosity is actually what would save the Western civilization, more curiosity. Because if you really think about it, it does come down to curiosity for the most part. That would change how we look at information and everything. A lot of our issues are around not being curious enough.
Katherine Brodsky, your book is No Apologies. People should check it out. Thank you for being on Dad Saves America. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.